All right, so I think a good topic for today is kind of going over a basic framework of how I think about nutrition. I doubt anything in here is going to be so unique to me that nobody's ever thought about it before, but I do think it's useful to have like a concrete framework of how to approach thinking about nutrition in sort of a logical stepwise manner. Okay, so when I think about nutrition, there's three basic categories or buckets or levers that you can think of when it comes to making any sort of changes from a nutritional standpoint. I want to be clear, this is not my framework. This comes from the work of Peter Attia. If you don't know him, definitely check him out. Smart guy. First one being caloric restriction, the second one being dietary restriction, and the third one being time restriction. So dietary restriction is probably the easiest one to start with. So anytime you hear about a particular diet, like the Atkins diet, being vegan, the paleo diet, whatever it might be, those are all examples of dietary restriction where you're restricting certain types of food in your day-to-day consumption. So the next one's caloric restriction. This one should also be pretty straightforward. All you're doing is reducing the amount of calories you're taking in a given day, regardless of where those calories are coming from. So the third one is time restriction. This is the one that most people don't consider or wouldn't consider in the same vein as the other two levers or buckets of caloric restriction and dietary restriction. So time restriction is simply just limiting the amount of time you can eat in a given day. The most obvious example of this is intermittent fasting, 16-8 protocol, a 24 protocol, whatever it's going to be. You're going to have a dedicated amount of time where you're restricting food or not eating food, and then you're going to follow it by a feeding window. 16-8 is 16 hours of fasting, 8-hour feeding window. And again, strictly speaking, if the only lever you're pulling is time restricted, then the only change you're making, you're not changing the amount of calories you're taking in, you're not changing the foods that those calories are coming from. The only thing you're changing is your time feeding window on a daily basis.
Verify your ID.
Of course.
Oh, I like the mustache. You don't get to see that with that mask.
It's a shame it's hidden.
That's a nice one. Are you going to get in the curve? Do that curve move.
Yeah, at some point. You have a great day. Thank you. Now, I'm not going to go into much more depth about like the particulars of a ketogenic diet or the particulars of time-restricted feeding, like fasting, for example. There's better channels out there for that, and I'm probably not the best resource. But I simply just wanted to lay out a framework of thinking about these three buckets or levers that you can pull. And I think it's important to first understand and identify each one of these buckets in isolation. So first understanding like what are the benefits of particular diets, and understand that by itself without dealing with caloric restriction and without dealing with time restriction. And then kind of once you're comfortable with those, then move on to caloric restriction. Understand the benefits and drawbacks of a hypo and hypercaloric diet. And then third, understanding the various types of time restriction from, a 16-8 intermittent fast, which is, not very hard. That's probably the easiest way to get people into any sort of time restriction, all the way up to like multi-day water fasts, which is a bit trickier. 2 hours ago, it was snowing and pouring and disgusting outside. Now this. We're invincible. I guess the last thing I'll mention on this is once you understand the mechanics of each individual lever, the dietary, the caloric, and the time restriction, then you can start understanding how they're going to work in concert and in combination with each other. Because from an overall health standpoint, rarely is it going to be just a singular intervention that's going to work. It's going to be a combination of pulling those levers, and you never really know which one's going to work for which person. So the better understanding you have and the better framework you have when looking at nutrition, it becomes easier to experiment with like how hard you're pulling each lever and which combinations of levers you're going to have to pull. So an example of kind of one of these combinations of levers would be taking time restriction, so doing intermittent fasting. And then one of the consequences of that routinely is caloric restriction as well, because the smaller feeding window, you only have 8 hours, or maybe you're doing like an 18-6, so you only have 6 hours. You're not going to be able to get 3 full meals in. It's usually going to be 2, if not a single large meal. Because of that, you usually end up getting caloric restriction as well. So first, understand all the individual principles and then start playing around with how to use them in combination and in concert with each other.